Luke Graham.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the member for Eastbourne, who's clearly well informed in these issues and shares a similar love of statistics with myself. I congratulate the member for Oldham East and Saddleworth for bringing this debate here this evening. And one point I would make, because it's been made by opposition members of Parliament, is talking about the UN report on supposed complacency on these benches. And I have to be clear, in the 18 months that I've been here, not one of me and my colleagues have been complacent about the welfare policies that we see play out in our constituency every single day. And I am very clear, and as I'll go on to elaborate in my speech, exactly some of the areas where I think we're doing quite well and other areas where there's still scope for further reform, as I'm sure other colleagues want to work with me and, of course, the ministers in trying to deliver. So, obviously, we're having this debate on the backdrop of significant changes to our welfare policy. We've had the DLA phased through to PIP, along with the attendance allowance for pensioners with care needs. And we've seen a big difference in the way the money is being spent as well. Some points have been made by opposition politicians tonight saying that, criticising the government, saying that costs have been cut on the backs of the most vulnerable in our society. Well, I've heard this allegation made against government ministers time and time again. That's why I went to the House of Commons Library to look at the overall expenditure that's taking place within our welfare system. And when you break it down, you look at it in 2009-10, it was only DLA, we didn't have PIP in 2009-10, around 10.3 billion was being spent. Now, when you add together and look at 2017-2018, DLA plus PIP, around £16 billion are being spent. So in cash terms, this is not a reduction in overall expenditure. And also, one of the opposition MPs, I know she's no longer in her place, but saying that we're cutting costs on the back of the most vulnerable, it's not fair and it's not accurate. I would ask opposition that if we're going to have a proper debate on and help the most vulnerable in our society, we should actually speak to the right facts. And these facts and statistics have come up time and time again as an issue just this week in this House. I think we owe it to all our constituents. I will give way, just let me take my point. We owe it to all our constituents to speak to the facts. And again, if you dispute them, take it up with the House of Commons Library. We've also, the problem with about some of these, bear with me one moment and we'll let you in. When you're looking at how these policies have come across, not only have they changed in the way the money is being distributed, but also how services are being delivered. And what's happened with a lot of the welfare reform, and I've seen it in my constituents that have come through to my office, is that many people have been on legacy benefits for the very first time are having some of those assumptions challenged and are being asked for reassessments. Now, sometimes that is for good, but sometimes I can see where there has been a detrimental impact, where they've fallen through the different changes, they've had a change of circumstance, they may have been changing between counties or in different parts of the countries, and that has had a negative impact on them as well. And that is why we've been raising questions in this House and raising issues with ministers to try and tackle these issues. I will give way.
The honourable gentleman tell me how many disabled people in 2009 were supported through the social security system and how many are supported now. It's important to have the denominator value so that you have a rate and not just cash values.
I couldn't agree more. And what I found really interesting when you went through these figures, we've got an increase of, I think, around 800,000 of people in 1664 who are now being classified as disabled. But I understand they were having previous classifications within the welfare system and receiving different benefits. So I don't think it's a simple change in the denominator which should then indicate the impact. But I would also refer to the government commitments they've made about making sure that people are receiving cash benefits. Well, no, I think it's a fair point. You asked me a direct point, I gave you a direct answer. And again, I'll happily go on a debate about the number of people that are now being classified as disabled. But there have been some positive movements in some of the changes that have been put forward by the government. We have seen an employment rate for disabled people go up from 43 to 51%, something that is welcomed. We've seen the Access to Work scheme, which I referred to earlier, which had 104 million going in 16-17, providing support to around 25,000 people. But again, none of us are complacent on this side of the House. We are very, very clear that changes still need to be made. And I know from a number of my constituents that have come into me talking about their experience through the assessment process, taking me through the actual paperwork, which I have gone through with a page-by-page of them to understand where they're having the difficulties. You can see that some of these changes have brought people into our offices, they've brought them into the welfare system, that for a long time they've lagged in the dark, where actually now assumptions are being challenged, new benefits are being offered, and as a result, new questions are coming from our constituents, whether I think we should try and answer as best as we can. I will give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I commend him for far more honest portrayal of his experience from his constituents from that side of the House. But can I just challenge the point that you made earlier on the figures? Of course, when you refer to these figures, you've been somewhat selective. The rate of inflation, costs have risen since 2010, so naturally the costs and the actual output and spend that you refer to will obviously be higher, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not disproportionately affecting people. Do you agree?
I would say that when you're looking at a 38% increase in cash terms, when they do the compound inflation rate over the same period, that would be less than 38%. So I'm happy to go through the calculations with her separately, but I don't think you would still actually have a real terms increase in the benefits that are being paid out. Madam Deputy Speaker, if you also look at the same time, with all of these policies, we're very, as constituency MPs, we see every day that comes into my staff and myself in my Alloa office and in my Crieff office, we see some of the human impact of some of the changes that are made in welfare. And I say again, and I actually am supportive of looking at how we assess the impacts on disabled people, because we are putting a considerable amount of money. My honourable friend from Air Carrick and Cumnock raised the point about the amount that's being spent on disabled benefits, and we are one of the highest spenders in the developed world, which I think is something that should be applauded. But if it isn't getting to the right people at the right time, then we need to see exactly how that is being administered and how our services are being delivered on the front line right across our country. And what I would say is that, I was lucky enough, like other members here, have hosted debates on Disability Confident. It is a fantastic scheme. The honourable member opposite raised earlier about how MPs should be signing up for that. My office is a member of the Disability Confident scheme, as I know are other colleagues right across the House. And what I can say is that Disability Competency, the Minister visited Glenalmond Timber in my constituency, and just one point that I hope everyone will be able to join with me is congratulating Jed Gardner, who's the production manager at Glenalmond Timber, who's now got the Disability Confident Leader status, the first in Scotland. So I hope you'd all join me in congratulating him for the fantastic work they're doing in Medvan of giving people with disabilities opportunities to work, which again, when I visited the company and when the Minister did too, you can clearly see the impact it has not only on the individual, but their family and their friends. So there's some incredible positive work being done by this government, as well as areas, as I said earlier, that we do need to put under continual review and indeed assess. Is the Minister? No, okay, just some water. Also, further to that, Madam Deputy Speaker, in my constituency, we also recently held an event, a joint event with a member from Stirling on Disability Confident in Alloa, in which we had local community groups attend, the DWP attend, and it was hosted in Inglewood House, which I'm glad to say, following that event, they immediately signed up to the Disability Confident scheme, which again, I think is an incredibly positive action and shows that companies in Clackmannanshire and Perth and Kinross are actually taking a government initiative from the green benches here and actually applying it in a daily way that you can actually see real improvement for our constituents' lives. I do have a number of concerns, as I said earlier, about how the assessment is taking place, and I actually would be supportive of looking at having an assessment of how these are being delivered. I'd hope to work with my government colleagues about how this would be, and I would hope it would be independent or certainly objective to make sure that our constituents and our government and ourselves will have the best possible view about how these disability benefits are being delivered. I'm conscious of time, but I will give way quickly. Yep.
Gentleman would agree with the recommendation of the Work and Pensions Select Committee in their report this week, that while waiting for a work capability assessment, it is unreasonable of the Department not to pay universal credit, because that is leaving people high and dry.
Yes, if you want a short answer, yes. And also, when we're talking about, I led the inquiry on universal credit in the Public Accounts Committee, and I'd refer any member to the House to the inquiry and the subsequent report from the Public Accounts Committee about where we identified the strengths and shortfalls of the universal credit system. And I hope government colleagues will have read that report and taken those recommendations into account. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would just like to come on to just one or two final points just before surmising, and that is the issue about, we've talked a lot about statistics earlier. One concern I have, and it's often not appreciated in this House of Commons, is that through the devolution of certain levels of statistics around the country, often we've now got different levels of government within the United Kingdom producing different statistics, which makes like-for-like comparisons quite difficult. In preparation for this debate tonight and the mental health debate that was pulled earlier, I actually had struggled getting figures from the House of Commons Library, because in Scotland we're not going along with certain NHS frameworks, quality for delivery frameworks now, and what we need to be able to is, even if different parts of the United Kingdom and different levels of government use different methods, we have to find a statistical method method to be able to find a uniform measure so we can actually have meaningful debate in this place. Otherwise, we're not comparing apple to apples, and it means we can't actually get a real view of how services are being delivered for our constituents. And so in that same vein as well, and this is a debate that has happened in the past, but it will be ongoing in this place, I'm sure, in the coming years, is about the devolution of welfare powers. And I have to say, I have a real concern about the devolution of welfare powers, not because it's one of, I think powers should all remain here and I want to sit on the green bench throne. It's because actually, when you're speaking to the most vulnerable people in our constituencies, as I know every member in this House does, the idea of adding in another agency, or one or two agencies, into this equation would make it even more difficult for them to get the help that they need. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is an issue. I do actually support that we should have an objective assessment of what these changes are doing for our constituents and for the most vulnerable. We are spending the money, but we've got to make sure it's going to the right place. For too long, benefits have become a party political issue. And I think when it comes to disability and helping the most vulnerable in our society, we can look past our parties and deliver for our constituents.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate the member for Oldham East and Saddleworth and the member for Stretford and Urmston for securing this important debate. On a daily basis, my office sees firsthand the horrendous and appalling impact the government's changes to the social security system have had on some of the most vulnerable people in my Aberavon constituency. Many of my constituents who come to my advice surgeries are usually at their wits' end, worried that their benefits are going to be stopped and that they won't be able to pay their rent or put food on the table for their children. We've seen hundreds of vulnerable constituents put through the humiliation of shambolic health assessments which cast doubt on their physical disabilities or mental health issues. And following that humiliation is the awful uncertainty and fear of the appeals process, which we almost always win. Some people have been awarded no points following PIP or ESA assessments, when quite clearly they are struggling with a disability or information has been inaccurately recorded. This has eroded confidence, not only in the assessment process, but in the whole system. And universal credit has landed people in rent arrears for the very first time. Some of their experiences are simply harrowing. In one case, a woman suffering with a degenerative disc condition for 27 years, along with depression and anxiety, waited over a year for her ESA assessment, only to have it cancelled on the day. A month later she was assessed, but the anxiety and stress of the wait, followed by the degrading assessment itself, led to a mini-stroke 2 days after the assessment. She now has high blood pressure, which puts her at risk of a further stroke. Despite all that, she was put onto the work-related category. That decision was overturned following a mandatory reconsideration. And she's not alone in having to go through this process. 75% of PIP decisions and 74% of ESA decisions were overturned on appeal in Wales in 2017. This high rate is symptomatic of the fundamental flaws in the initial assessment process. If the correct decisions were made from the outset, then a lot of the misery, worry and suffering would be avoided. When you raise these problems with government, you get the same response time after time, that the government don't recognise these big problems and will carry on regardless. It's like an ostrich with its head buried in the sand. But that is indicative of the government's track record. Carry on until you are shamed into doing something about it. But what can be more shaming than when a United Nations poverty envoy says that changes to social security have meant that great misery has also been inflicted unnecessarily, especially on working poor, on single mothers struggling against mighty odds, on people with disabilities who are already marginalised, and on millions of children who are being locked into a cycle of poverty, is what was published in the report. It is appalling and inexcusable that this is happening in a G7 country. Our social security system is there as a safety net for the most vulnerable. Right now that safety net is failing. MPs, the Equality and Human Rights Commission and the United Nations have all called on the government to conduct a cumulative impact assessment. If the government is so confident that they're doing the right thing, then they have nothing to fear over commissioning this assessment. But ultimately, the government must stop burying its head in the sand over this and wake up to the reality that their punitive and callous policies are causing misery and hardship to hundreds of my constituents and hundreds of thousands of people around this country. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Karen Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I very much want to thank my honourable friend from Oldham East and Saddleworth and the Backbench Committee for bringing this debate before Parliament, because it does allow us to shine a spotlight on the experiences of our constituents who are living with a long-term illness or disability and who are relying on financial support from the government. Now, support has dwindled for these people in recent years, with the nearly 6,000 people in Bristol South who are currently claiming employment and support allowance because they are unable to work because of illness or disability. The national evidence is already clear. The cumulative impact of tax and welfare reforms report published earlier this year by the Equality and Human Rights Commission found that changes to taxes, benefits, tax credits and universal credit announced since 2010 affect the poorest hardest, and the ill or disabled people are some of the worst hit. But this isn't just a loss of income, shocking as it is, that impacts on disabled people. There is something very wrong with the government's instructions to staff in the DWP and the culture that is being created within the department, because the number of constituents in Bristol South who have been forced to appeal, initially refused employment and support allowance or personal dependent payments, is appalling, as others have mentioned. Now, the fantastic work that is done by the South Bristol Advice Service based in Withywood, they do a great job in supporting those who need help. But the determination required simply to make a claim is often too much for those suffering with long-term conditions or life-changing illnesses. And there is little evidence of compassion in the system. Sadly, universal credit is making that situation worse, both in financial terms and the complexity of the claims process. And the government has already admitted that the most disabled people's incomes will not be fully protected. And already I'm seeing constituents who are losing out simply because of change in their circumstances. Now, promises about future backdated transitional payments ring hollow when you can't afford the rent because your universal claim is in disarray 3 months after moving to a bungalow adapted for a disability. Rent arrears have spiralled, in one case because a blind constituent was informed only in writing that universal credit now included an element for rent. No one contacted her to inform her verbally. Now, I do want to pay tribute to the persistence and resilience of my constituents who daily face the challenge of their medical conditions and who must also deal with the current system. I applaud those who have come to accept that actually a mandatory reconsideration and an appeal to Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service are just part of the claims process. And my constituent who informed me that he has completed his 3rd successful appeal has my admiration and my respect. But I know that there are far too many others who simply don't carry on with their claim, who get ground down by the bureaucracy, who miss out on vital financial support and whose health, as others have mentioned, suffers greatly as a consequence. Of course, the government should commission an independent cumulative assessment of the impact of changes in the social security system on sick and disabled people, their families and carers. But they should also act now, immediately, to stop the rollout of universal credit to ill or disabled people.
Ruth George. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government side appear to be arguing that there should not be a cumulative impact assessment on disabled people, as my honourable friend for Oldham East and Saddleworth has argued so eloquently. But there's plenty of figures out there, so I'm glad the Minister's disagreeing, and I very much hope that she will put me right and that she will agree to this happening. Because we already know that 30% of families with someone with a disability are in poverty, and that's 10% higher than the rest of the population. In fact, half of people in poverty, according to the Social Mobility Commission, nearly 7 million are in a household with an adult with a disability. So fixing the problems of poverty for people with disability will go a long way to fixing the problems of the UK's high level of poverty. We've seen successive cuts to benefits that affect people with disabilities over the last 8 years. From 2013, we saw a 1% benefit uprating for 3 years. Employment and support allowance lost over 5% of its value compared to RPI, 3% compared to CPI. The 4-year benefits freeze will take off 6.5% compared to CPI, and a full 10% of the value of that benefit compared to retail price index. 15% of the value of that benefit lost over 7 years. These are not generous benefits in the first place. But in addition, many disabled people have had to cope with the cuts to local housing allowance, down to 30% of median rent, so they have to bulk up their rent out of their meagre allowances for ESA. Child tax credit has been frozen as well. The childcare element in tax credits has been the same maximum since 2005, and the percentage reduced from 80% to 70%. In addition, we've seen the bedroom tax, which affects so many people with disabilities, and the work-related activity group £30 under ESA abolished. People with disabilities have been facing all of those cuts before we even see the cuts under universal credit. And it's for this reason that people with disabilities feel so strongly that there needs to be a cumulative impact assessment of the full impact of this history of serious cuts to their income. Under universal credit, we're also seeing cuts to children with disabilities. The government claims to support and protect the most vulnerable in society, but as my constituent, a single parent with a son with a disability, wrote to me, he said, "My son is 6 years old. He is practically bedbound. Yet the government wants to transfer me onto universal credit because I can no longer work and to support him, and his support will be reduced." If my disabled son is not one of the most vulnerable people who needs protection and support, then who is? And I would put that question to the Minister today. The difficulties in claiming universal credit for people with disability have been set out in many cases elsewhere, but because at the moment rollout has been mostly to people who've been on JSA and not to people who've been on employment and support allowance who have got disabilities, we haven't seen the scale of support that's needed. But I'm already in my constituency, as I mentioned earlier, seeing problems with people with disabilities getting home visits that they feel that they need. Families in particular are feeling the cuts, and parents who are disabled with children who are disabled as well. My honourable friend set out the appalling level of cuts of nearly £10,000 a year that those families will see the reduction in their income under universal credit. It's no wonder that families fear for universal credit. A constituent wrote to me with a 4-year-old son who's autistic and non-verbal. She's had to give up work in order to care for him because she can't get care in the school holidays. So as well as losing her own wage, they've also lost tax credits. They looked to claim housing benefit but found that they would need to claim universal credit instead. Because they've already racked up rent arrears, because their income's been so reduced, if they face 5 weeks' wait for support under universal credit, by that time my constituent says they could end up losing the house they've been in tenant in for the last 21 years. I hope that the government will be listening to these real stories of people who are suffering already. I've only had universal credit in my constituency in High Peak for just 2.5 months, and already I am seeing constituents who are suffering under it. But that's on top of all the constituents who are suffering from employment support allowance and PIP assessments. And in the Work and Pensions Select Committee, I set out to the Minister the experience, the very harrowing experience that I heard of a group of survivors of sexual violence and their experiences of the PIP assessments. How one woman was curled up on the floor crying and sobbing uncontrollably. The assessor simply repeated the questions at her deadpan, offered her no support or understanding whatsoever. I was very pleased that the Minister agreed with me at that point that that is a disgusting situation that should not be allowed to continue. And in response to the Work and Pensions Select Committee's report on PIP and ESA assessments, the Government promised to look at the recording of those assessments as a matter of fact, and to bring that in. But on questioning the Permanent Secretary today in Select Committee, we heard that he has no idea how that is being rolled out when a commitment was made 8 months ago to do that. There are still people suffering because of the lack of appointments. My constituent, who was looking to claim PIP, said that she was forced to purchase her own recording equipment if she wanted her assessment to be recorded, whereas in the past she knows that the assessment centre have used their own equipment. She was also looking to get support with getting to the assessment centre. She was told that she could get there in a taxi, but that it would cost £100 up front. She could only claim that back 30 days later after her assessment. So people with disabilities are not being treated in the way that they should be treated. And that is possibly part of the problem, but I'm afraid it's a culture that we're coming across time and time again in our surgeries and from our constituents. In PIP assessments, the Disability Benefits Consortium found that 8 out of 10 people who underwent an assessment found it made their health worse. 2/3 felt that they'd been poorly assessed. Constituents, particularly with mental health difficulties, find that those difficulties are not adequately assessed. My constituent said that the bulk of the questions she was asked, although she presented with serious mental health difficulties, were aimed at her physical health, where she only has minor conditions that don't prevent her working, and only 1/3 of the time was spent on covering her mental health. Those questions were loaded, and when she tried to expand and explain her answers, she was told to stick to the questions. My constituent has been left on the verge of suicide from that assessment and the struggle of waiting for a response for what will happen to it. And as my honourable friend set out so starkly, then there has been an increase in suicides from people who have been undergoing work capability and PIP assessments. None of us want to see this happen. I raised again in committee with the Minister that constituents of mine were being asked why they had not yet committed suicide. I'm very pleased that the Minister again took that back, and from the cases that I've received more recently, that question has not come up again. So I very much hope that that practice is spreading through the privatised companies that do these assessments, but there's so much more to do, as cases just from my one very rural, relatively affluent constituency show.
Would the Honourable Lady give way?
Yes.
thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. She's making an extremely powerful speech. In relation to the assessments, as Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Disability, we've also been hearing that there are particular difficulties for people with acquired brain injury and also epilepsy in relation to the types of questions that have been asked. And I'm wondering if she would agree with me that perhaps the assessment should be more sensitive in relation to the different types of disabilities that present.
Thank you very much. And Honourable Friend makes a very relevant point that certainly from the evidence that my constituents with mental health and with brain injuries bring to me, then the assessment centres on physical health and physical difficulties. And I know from my time, 20 years working for the Shop Workers Union, USDOR, that work is not easy these days for people to do, particularly if you've got a long-term health condition. Employers now have sickness absence procedures where you often can't have more than 3 periods of sickness absence, however short, in any 6-month period. And if you have a disability, particularly if it's one where you don't have a union representative who can support you under the Equalities Act, then people with disabilities are simply slipping through the net and not performing and being left out of the workplace. And unfortunately, universal credit and the cuts to that benefit is going to trap people with disabilities more without work, because if they at the moment are on a higher level benefit with premiums in there, if they take up a short-term period of work, as one of my constituents has who took on a job working for the Royal Mail over the Christmas period for 6 weeks, he felt relatively well in himself and wanted to do that job. He's just found out that when he finishes that job, he will be transferred onto universal credit and he will lose his transitional protection and his support. So it's not a message that is telling people with disabilities, try and work, try and do your best. And we see even more problems with the system where people with disabilities are being refused work capability assessments and are not seeing any money at all. One of my constituents was presented to me by a support charity 6 months ago. They'd been trying for 6 months to get him some money since he'd failed his ESA. He had a fit note. He should have been getting money. Only with my intervention did he get support. That was 6 months that he was living off our friends and family and from food bank parcels. Yes.
For giving way. I wonder whether she saw the comment made by Professor Alston in his report, and I quote, "Great misery has also been inflicted unnecessarily on people with disabilities who are already marginalised." Ministers have sought to dismiss those criticisms, but doesn't that actually sum up pretty well the experience of a very large number of the people up and down the country?
Thank you very much to my honourable friend for making that important point, which was going to be the point on which I ended my speech with quoting from a constituent with a disability who wrote to me to say she set out the experience that she'd had. She wasn't asking for support. She was able to fight the system. But she said, the reason I'm writing to you is to encourage you to keep fighting for us in Westminster, to be the voice that is taken away from the disabled people in this country. Please fight to put an end to this barbaric, humiliating assessment system, where the person who makes life or death decisions doesn't even get to meet you, isn't medically qualified, specific to the individual condition, and is meeting targets to refuse claims. That is the view that is out there amongst people with disabilities. They want Parliament to be seen to be supporting them. Of the changes that came in the budget to universal credit, they did not affect people with disabilities, some of those who are worst impacted by cuts to universal credit. So I very much hope that the Minister and the Government will be listening. Thank you.